The morning I came home early to surprise my wife with flowers, I found every wall in our house painted a flat, lifeless white, and every photograph, every drawing, every trace of the 22 years we had built together, gone, as if our life had never existed at all. If you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in the quiet miracle of second chances, then before you read another word, take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel, because stories like this one remind all of us that even in our darkest, most confusing moments, love still finds a way back home. My name is Walter Bregman, and for most of my life I believed that the house on Larkspur Lane was the safest place on earth. It was a modest two-story colonial with a wraparound porch and a crooked mailbox that I never got around to fixing, the kind of home that wears its history in its walls the way an old man wears the lines on his face, with pride rather than shame. My wife, Colleen, and I bought it back when we were young and broke and hopelessly in love, back when the idea of a mortgage terrified us more than anything else in the world. We painted the nursery ourselves before our daughter was born, a soft buttery yellow because we didn't know if we were having a boy or a girl and didn't care either way. We hung a growth chart on the kitchen doorframe and marked it every birthday, even after our daughter, Josephine, grew taller than her mother and rolled her eyes at the ritual but let us do it anyway. We filled the hallway with photographs, some crooked, some faded, all of them precious, documenting birthdays and graduations and a disastrous camping trip where Colleen fell into the lake trying to save us more. That hallway was the timeline of our marriage. It was the museum of our ordinary, beautiful life. I need you to understand that before that morning, Colleen and I were not a couple in crisis. We were not the kind of people who screamed at each other or slept in separate rooms or counted the days until the children left so we could quietly separate. We had our seasons, certainly. There were years when work consumed us, when Josephine's teenage moods filled the house with slammed doors, when money was tight enough that we ate the same casserole for 4 nights running and pretended to enjoy it. But underneath all of that, there was a steadiness between us, a kind of quiet trust that I had never questioned. I trusted Colleen the way I trusted the sun to rise. So when I tell you what happened that Tuesday morning, I need you to understand that nothing in the 22 years before it had prepared me for it. I worked as a project manager at a mid-sized construction firm downtown, the kind of job that required early mornings and long commutes but rarely surprises. That particular Tuesday, our site inspection had been cancelled because of a burst water main, and rather than sit in the office pretending to be useful, I decided to do something I hadn't done in years. I stopped at the little flower stand on Ferris Street, the one run by an elderly Greek man named Spiro who always slipped in an extra stem of baby's breath for no charge, and I bought Colleen a bouquet of her favorite ranunculus, the ruffled pink ones that always reminded her of her mother's garden. I remember feeling almost giddy on the drive home, the way you feel when you're 25 and still trying to impress the person you love, except I was 51 and had been married to that person for over 2 decades, and somehow the giddiness felt even sweeter because of it. I pulled into the driveway and noticed the smell before I noticed anything else, that unmistakable chemical sharpness of fresh paint hanging in the August air. My first thought, foolishly, was that Colleen had finally hired someone to fix the water stain on the ceiling of the guest bathroom, something we had been arguing about lazily for the better part of a year. I walked in through the side door, calling her name, the flowers still wrapped in their brown paper, and the words died in my throat. The hallway was white. Not eggshell, not cream, not any of the warm, forgiving colors Colleen usually gravitated toward, but a stark, clinical, gallery white, the kind of white you see in office buildings and hospital corridors. And the photographs, the entire timeline of our life, was gone. Not rearranged. Not stored away for repainting. Gone, the nail holes patched and sanded smooth, as if a professional had come through and erased 22 years of evidence that we had ever lived there at all. I stood in that hallway for what felt like an eternity, the flowers slipping slightly in my sweating hands, and I felt something crack open in my chest that I didn't have a name for yet. I walked through the rest of the house in a kind of numb, disbelieving trance. The living room, once covered in Josephine's childhood artwork and the quilt Colleen's grandmother had made us as a wedding gift, was bare and white. The quilt itself was gone from the back of the armchair where it had lived for 2 decades. The kitchen doorframe, our growth chart, the one with Josephine's height marked in pencil every year since she was 4, had been painted over so completely that I had to run my fingers along the wood to convince myself it had ever been there. Even the small brass plaque by the front door, the one that read, "The Bregmans, EST 2003, handmade by my father before he passed," had been taken down and was nowhere in sight. I called out for Colleen again, and this time I heard movement upstairs, the soft creak of the guest room floor. I climbed the stairs 2 at a time, my heart hammering in a way that had nothing to do with the exertion, and found her sitting on the edge of the guest bed, still in her painting clothes, a smear of white across her cheekbone, staring at her own hands as if she didn't recognize them. She looked up at me, and I will never forget the expression on her face. It wasn't guilt, and it wasn't defiance. It was something closer to fear, the kind of fear you see in someone who has just woken up in an unfamiliar place and cannot remember how they got there. I asked her, as gently as I could manage given the storm rising in my chest, what had happened to our home. I asked her where the photographs were, where the quilt was, where Josephine's growth chart had gone. And Colleen looked at me with those wide, frightened eyes and said something that I still hear in my sleep sometimes. She said, "I don't know why I did it, Walter. I woke up this morning and I just felt like I couldn't breathe in this house anymore. Like the walls were closing in on me. I started with one room, just to feel like I could control something, and then I couldn't stop. I don't understand what came over me. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because this is not a story about a saintly husband who reacted with perfect grace. I felt rage. A deep, disorienting rage that frightened me because I had never felt anything like it toward Colleen before. I felt as though she had reached into my chest and torn out the part of me that held every good memory I had, every proof that our life together had mattered. I said things I regret, sharp, wounding things about selfishness and carelessness, about how she had erased our daughter's childhood as if it meant nothing. Colleen didn't defend herself. She simply sat there, absorbing every word, her hands trembling slightly, and when I finally ran out of breath, she said quietly that she understood if I couldn't forgive her, but that something had been wrong inside her for months, and she hadn't known how to tell me. I left the house that afternoon without another word, the ranunculus still sitting forgotten on the kitchen counter, already beginning to wilt in the summer heat. I drove to my brother Desmond's place across town, a modest apartment above his auto shop, and I told him everything, pacing his small living room like a man possessed. Desmond, who had always been the calmer of the two of us, listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he asked me a single question that I couldn't answer. He asked me if I had considered that something might be wrong with Colleen, rather than something being wrong with our marriage. I told him I didn't know what he meant. He said, "Walter, you just described a woman erasing 2 decades of memories in a single morning, with no warning, no plan, no reason she can explain. That's not the behavior of someone who stopped loving her family. That sounds like someone who's drowning." I didn't want to hear it. I wanted to be angry, because anger was simpler than fear, and the truth was that underneath my fury, I was terrified. I spent that night on Desmond's pull-out couch, staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail of Colleen's face when she'd looked up at me from the guest bed. I thought about the past few months, searching for clues I might have missed. I remembered that she had seemed more tired than usual, that she had started forgetting small things, like where she'd left her keys or whether she'd already told me a story. I remembered that she had stopped humming while she cooked, a habit so constant throughout our marriage that its absence had become its own kind of silence, one I hadn't noticed until that moment, lying in the dark in my brother's apartment. Our daughter Josephine called me the next morning, her voice tight with worry. She had driven over to the house after Colleen called her in tears, unable to explain what had happened or why. Josephine was 26 then, living 40 minutes away with her boyfriend, working as a pediatric nurse, a career she'd chosen, she always said, because she wanted to spend her life taking care of people the way her parents had taken care of her. She told me that when she arrived, she found her mother sitting alone in the white, empty hallway, staring at the patched-over nail holes, repeating over and over that she didn't understand what she had done. Josephine said Colleen kept asking her where the photographs were, as if she herself hadn't been the one to take them down, as if some other version of her had done this terrible thing and left her alone to face the wreckage. That detail struck something in me, some memory of medical articles I had half-read years ago, though I hadn't thought about them since. I asked Josephine, with my voice barely steady, whether her mother seemed confused, truly confused, or whether she was simply distraught over what she'd done. Josephine was quiet for a long moment before she said that it felt different from ordinary distress, that her mother's confusion seemed to go deeper than guilt, as though pieces of the last few hours had genuinely slipped away from her. I drove back to the house that afternoon, not because my anger had disappeared, but because fear had finally outpaced it. I found Colleen in the kitchen, sitting at the table where we had eaten 10,000 meals together, staring at the wall where Josephine's growth chart used to be. She didn't look up when I walked in. I pulled out the chair across from her, the one I had sat in every morning for over 2 decades, and I asked her, as calmly as I could, to walk me through her entire day, from the moment she woke up. She told me she remembered waking up early, before her alarm, feeling a strange, crawling anxiety she couldn't name. She remembered going downstairs to make coffee and standing in the hallway, staring at our photographs, and feeling an overwhelming urge to take them all down, as if the images themselves were somehow suffocating her. She remembered going to the garage for the leftover paint from when we'd redone the porch trim 2 summers earlier. But after that, her memory became patchy, full of gaps she couldn't explain. She remembered painting, remembered the smell, remembered her arms aching, but she couldn't recall making the decision to remove the growth chart or take down my father's brass plaque. She said it felt as though she had watched herself do these things from somewhere outside her own body, unable to stop, unable to fully understand why. I want to tell you that I immediately understood what was happening, that I was wise and patient and had all the answers, but the truth is that I sat across from my wife of 22 years and felt a fear so total that it made the earlier anger feel almost like a comfort. Anger, at least, gave me something to hold on to. This new fear was formless. I asked her if she would be willing to see a doctor, and to my surprise, she agreed immediately, her eyes filling with tears of what I now recognize as relief, the relief of a person who has been frightened of her own mind for longer than she admitted and has finally been given permission to ask for help. We saw our family physician, Dr. Amara Voss, 2 days later. I remember sitting in that small examination room, Colleen's hand cold in mine, while Dr. Voss asked careful, probing questions about sleep patterns and stress and any recent changes in memory or mood. Colleen answered honestly, admitting things I hadn't known, that she had been having trouble sleeping for months, that she'd started writing herself notes to remember simple tasks, that she had experienced 2 or 3 episodes over the past year where she found herself somewhere in the house without remembering how she got there or what she had intended to do. She admitted, quietly, that she had been too ashamed and too frightened to tell me, because she was afraid it meant something was seriously wrong with her, and she didn't want to become a burden. That word, burden, struck me harder than anything else in that room. 22 years of marriage, and my wife had been carrying a private terror alone, convinced that admitting her fear would make her a weight around my neck rather than a person I loved enough to help carry anything. I held her hand tighter and told her, right there in front of Dr. Voss, that she could never be a burden to me, that whatever this was, we would face it together the way we had faced everything else, the lean years and the arguments about money and the terrifying night Josephine had her appendix out at 14. Colleen cried quietly, and for the first time since that Tuesday morning, I felt something other than fear settle into the space between us. I felt purpose. Dr. Voss ordered a series of tests, blood work to rule out thyroid issues and vitamin deficiencies, a referral to a neurologist for further evaluation, and a recommendation that Colleen see a therapist to talk through what she was experiencing emotionally. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of our marriage, filled with waiting rooms and phone calls and the particular exhaustion that comes from not knowing. I took time off work, more than I probably should have, but I couldn't bear the thought of Colleen facing any of it alone, not after learning how alone she had already been feeling for months. During those weeks, something unexpected began to happen between us. Stripped of the comfortable routines that had defined our marriage for so long, without the photographs on the wall or the familiar clutter of our shared history, we were forced to actually talk to each other in a way we hadn't in years. I don't mean the easy conversations about grocery lists and Josephine's latest boyfriend and whether the gutters needed cleaning. I mean the harder conversations, the ones about fear and mortality and the quiet resentments that build up in any long marriage like sediment at the bottom of a river. Colleen told me she had been terrified for over a year that something was wrong with her mind, that she had watched her own mother decline with early-onset dementia in her late 50s and had spent every day since her 50th birthday secretly cataloging her own small forgetfulnesses, convinced she was watching the same slow erosion begin in herself. She told me that on that Tuesday morning, in some confused, desperate part of her mind, she believed that if she erased the evidence of the life she was afraid of losing, the loss itself might not hurt so much when it came. It was, she said through tears, the closest thing she could describe to a kind of panic, a person trying to control an uncontrollable fear by destroying the very thing she was afraid to lose, so that losing it would feel like a choice rather than a theft. I held her while she said this, in our stripped bare living room with its blank white walls, and I understood, finally, that what I had walked into that Tuesday morning was not an act of carelessness or coldness, but the visible wreckage of a private storm my wife had been enduring in silence for far too long. I thought about all the moments over the previous year when she had seemed distracted, distant, when I had assumed she was simply tired or preoccupied with her sister's health problems or Josephine's engagement plans, and I felt a fresh wave of shame at how easily I had accepted the surface explanation rather than asking deeper questions. I had been living beside my wife's fear without ever truly seeing it. The neurologist, a soft-spoken man named Dr. Okonkwo Reyes, ran a battery of cognitive tests over several appointments. I sat in the waiting room each time, my hands folded so tightly together that my knuckles ached, praying in a way I hadn't prayed since Josephine's appendix scare, bargaining with a God I wasn't entirely sure I believed in, promising that if Colleen was alright, I would never again take a single ordinary Tuesday for granted. When the results finally came back, they showed no signs of early dementia, no tumors, no structural abnormalities. What they did show, combined with everything Colleen had described, was a severe anxiety disorder compounded by a specific and treatable condition called dissociative episodes, often triggered in people carrying unprocessed grief or chronic, unaddressed fear. Dr. Okonkwo Reyes explained, with a gentleness I will always be grateful for, that under extreme emotional distress, the mind sometimes protects itself by disconnecting a person from their own actions, creating exactly the kind of gaps and confusion Colleen had described. It was not, he assured us both, a sign of impending memory loss or dementia. It was, in its own strange way, her mind's desperate attempt to manage a fear that had grown too large to hold. I won't pretend that hearing this diagnosis erased the pain of walking into that white, empty hallway. I won't pretend that some nights, in the months that followed, I didn't lie awake grieving the photographs we could never fully recreate, the specific angle of light in the one picture of baby Josephine asleep on my chest, the quilt from Colleen's grandmother that had been accidentally thrown away with the drop cloths before anyone realized what had happened. Some losses, even understood, even forgiven, still ache. But understanding transformed the nature of my grief. I was no longer grieving a betrayal. I was grieving alongside my wife, for a fear she had carried alone for too long, a fear that had finally broken through the surface in the only way her overwhelmed mind knew how. Colleen began seeing a therapist twice a week, a compassionate, no-nonsense woman named Priya Fenwickhart who specialized in anxiety and grief processing. I attended several sessions with her, at Priya's gentle suggestion, so that I could better understand what Colleen was working through and how I could support her without either smothering her or retreating into the kind of wounded distance that had, if I was honest with myself, characterized parts of our marriage during difficult seasons before. Those sessions were humbling. I learned that I had a habit, developed over decades, of responding to my own fear with anger, a pattern I could trace back to watching my own father handle stress the same way when I was a boy. I learned that Colleen had spent years believing that expressing vulnerability would disappoint me, because early in our marriage, during a difficult stretch after Josephine's birth, I had once told her, in frustration and exhaustion, that I needed her to be strong for both of us. She had carried those words for over 2 decades, quietly building a version of herself that never asked for help, until the pressure of that performance finally broke something loose. I am not proud of realizing, at 51 years old, that a single tired sentence spoken during a hard month when Josephine was an infant had shaped so much of how my wife moved through our marriage. But I am grateful that it finally came to light, because understanding it allowed us to begin dismantling it together. I told Colleen, in one of those difficult therapy sessions, that I had never wanted her to be strong for both of us. I had wanted, more than anything, to be strong enough for both of us, and somewhere along the way, exhaustion had made me say the opposite of what I meant. Colleen wept when I said this, not from sadness, but from something closer to relief, the particular relief of finally understanding that a wound you've carried for decades was born from a moment of human weakness rather than a fundamental truth about your own worth. If this part of the story feels familiar to you, if you've ever carried a private fear alone because you believed sharing it would make you a burden to the people you love, I want you to know that you are not alone, and I hope you'll leave a comment below sharing what forgiveness or second chances have meant in your own life, because these stories matter, and so does your voice in this community. The rebuilding of our home, both literally and figuratively, happened slowly, over the better part of a year. We didn't rush to repaint the walls or replace every photograph, in part because Dr. Fenwickhart suggested that Colleen and I use the process itself as a kind of healing ritual, something we could do together rather than something that needed to be fixed and forgotten as quickly as possible. On weekends, we began going through old boxes in the attic and the garage, digital backups I had, thank God, saved to an external hard drive years earlier during a brief and uncharacteristic bout of organizational ambition, and copies that Josephine and various relatives had squirreled away over the years without our knowledge. Slowly, painstakingly, we began reconstructing the timeline of our life, and in doing so, we found ourselves reliving it, laughing over forgotten details, crying over pictures of Colleen's late mother, arguing gently over whose memory of a particular vacation was more accurate. Josephine became an unexpected architect of this rebuilding. She had, it turned out, photographed nearly every family gathering for the past decade on her phone, uploading them to a cloud service none of us had known to check. She spent an entire weekend with us, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor surrounded by printed photographs curling slightly from the printer's fresh ink, organizing them by year with the same careful precision she brought to her nursing charts. At one point, she found a photograph none of us remembered taking, a candid shot from her college graduation of the three of us laughing about something lost to memory, Colleen's head thrown back, my arm around her shoulders, Josephine caught mid-sentence with her cap slightly askew. Colleen held that photograph for a long time before she said, quietly, that she was grateful, in a strange way, that the house had been emptied, because it had forced all three of us to remember, together, on purpose, rather than simply walking past faded photographs on our way to the kitchen without truly seeing them anymore. That comment stayed with me for a long time afterward. There was a painful truth buried inside it, one I hadn't wanted to admit before that Tuesday morning. In the years before the walls went white, I had, without realizing it, stopped truly seeing our home. The photographs had become wallpaper, familiar to the point of invisibility. I walked past pictures of my daughter's childhood every single day without pausing to actually look at them, without remembering the specific joy of the moment they captured. It took losing them, however painfully, however frighteningly, to teach me that memories kept but unexamined are not so different from memories lost. Colleen's frightened, desperate act had, in its own devastating way, forced our family to stop taking our history for granted. We chose the new colors for the walls together that autumn, sitting at the kitchen table with paint swatches spread out like a hand of cards, something we hadn't done since we first bought the house 22 years earlier. Colleen wanted warmer tones this time, deep golden ochres for the living room and a soft sage green for the hallway, colors that reminded her, she said, of feeling held rather than exposed. We hired a professional this time, not because we didn't trust ourselves, but because Colleen said she wanted this repainting to feel different, deliberate and celebratory rather than desperate and frightened. I remember standing in the hallway on the day the new paint finally dried, watching the light from the front window catch the soft green in a way that made the whole space feel gentle in a manner the old white walls never had. Colleen stood beside me, her hand slipping into mine, and she said that for the first time in over a year, she felt like she could breathe in her own home. We rehung the photographs slowly, choosing them with more intention this time. Rather than simply filling every inch of wall space the way we had before, we selected specific images that captured moments we wanted to actively remember, and beneath several of them, Colleen, who had always had a beautiful, looping handwriting, wrote small captions on cream-colored cards, not just dates but brief memories, the story of the lake and the more. The year Josephine insisted on a purple birthday cake and cried when it came out slightly gray from too much food coloring, the afternoon my father helped us install the brass plaque by the front door, joking that he expected us to still be living in this house when he was 100 years old, a milestone he sadly never reached but one that felt, somehow, honored every time I walked past his handwriting-inspired plaque, which Josephine, in a gesture that moved me to tears, had tracked down a replica of using an old photograph she'd taken of the original years before, sending it to a local metalworker who recreated it almost perfectly. We also, at Dr. Fenwickhart's gentle suggestion, added something new to the hallway that hadn't existed before, a small section near the kitchen doorway where we started a new growth chart, not for measuring height, since Josephine was long past that particular milestone, but for marking something Colleen called our resilience dates, small notes commemorating hard days we had gotten through together, the day of Colleen's diagnosis, the day she completed her first full year of therapy, the day I finally, fully forgave myself for the anger I had unleashed on that terrible Tuesday morning, an anger I had judged far more harshly than Colleen ever did. It became, in its own strange way, a more honest kind of memorial than the picture-perfect hallway we'd had before, because it made space not just for our joys but for our struggles, for the truth that a family's history is made as much from the hard days survived as from the celebrations captured in photographs. I think often about what might have happened if I had reacted differently that Tuesday afternoon, if my brother Desmond hadn't asked me that quiet, difficult question that cracked open my anger just enough to let fear and love back in. I think about how easy it would have been to let that single devastating morning define the rest of our marriage, to walk out that door and never fully walk back in, convinced that Colleen had betrayed something sacred rather than recognizing that she had been drowning in a fear so large she didn't have the words to ask for help. I think about all the marriages that end not because love has disappeared, but because fear, confusion, and shame prevent two people from truly seeing each other in the moments that matter most. I am not a religious man in any formal sense, but I believe, with everything in me, that the flowers I happened to buy that morning, the ordinary impulse of a husband wanting to surprise his wife, were a kind of grace, a small nudge that brought me home at exactly the moment I needed to be there, not to witness a betrayal, but to catch my wife before she fell any further into a fear she could no longer hold alone. Colleen and I celebrated our 23rd wedding anniversary this past spring, in the same house on Larkspur Lane, its walls now warm and golden and green, its hallway telling a fuller, more honest story than it ever had before. Josephine got married last autumn to a kind, steady man named Cormac who works as a high school science teacher and who looked at our resilience wall during his first visit to the house and asked, with genuine curiosity rather than judgment, what it meant, and Colleen told him the whole story, unflinching, unashamed, ending with the observation that the worst day of her life had somehow become the beginning of the most honest chapter of her marriage. Cormac, Josephine told me later, cried a little, and told her that he hoped he and Josephine would have the courage to be that honest with each other someday, should life ever ask it of them. I share this story with our channel not because I believe our experience is unique, but because I believe, deeply, that it is not. I believe there are people watching this right now who are carrying private fears they haven't voiced to the people who love them most, convinced that their struggles would only become a burden. I believe there are people who have walked into their own version of that white, empty hallway, whether literally or metaphorically, and mistaken a loved one's silent suffering for carelessness or betrayal. If you are one of those people, on either side of that particular pain, I hope our story offers you something like the flowers I carried into my own home that Tuesday morning, a small, unexpected reason to pause before you let anger have the final word, a reminder that the people we love are often fighting battles far larger and far quieter than we realize, and that understanding, patience, and forgiveness can rebuild almost anything, even a home stripped bare of every memory it once held. Before I go, I want to ask you something, because I believe your answer matters more than you know. Have you ever misunderstood someone you loved during their hardest moment, only to discover later that what looked like carelessness or coldness was actually pain they didn't know how to express? I would love for you to share that story in the comments below, whatever it looks like, whatever the ending was, because I believe every single one of those stories, painful or hopeful, adds something important to this community we're building together, a reminder that behind every confusing, hurtful moment, there is often a human being simply trying to survive something too heavy to carry alone. If this story touched your heart even a little, please take a moment to like this video, leave a meaningful comment sharing your own thoughts or experiences, share it with someone in your life who might need a reminder of hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story like this one. Our family's story didn't end in that white, empty hallway, and I have to believe that whatever hard chapter you might be walking through right now doesn't have to be the end of your story either. Sometimes the very thing that looks like the collapse of everything we've built is actually the painful, necessary beginning of something more honest, more resilient, and ultimately more beautiful than what came before. Colleen and I are proof of that, standing together in a home whose walls no longer hide our struggles but hold them, alongside every joy we've shared, in colors we chose together, on purpose, with open eyes, and it is, without question, the truest home we have ever built.